On their 14th wedding anniversary, Charles told Diana three words that destroyed whatever was left of their marriage. What happened at that dinner table at Kensington Palace that July night would officially end the fairy tale the world had believed in for over a decade. This is the story of the most devastating anniversary dinner in royal history. Subscribe for more untold royal stories, and let me know in the comments what you think about this heartbreaking moment. July 29th, 1995. 14 years to the day since the world watched a shy 20-year-old kindergarten teacher marry the heir to the British throne in what was called the wedding of the century. But the woman who stood in her private dining room at Kensington Palace that evening bore little resemblance to the radiant bride who had captured the world's heart in 1981. Princess Diana was 34 years old, though the stress of the last few years had aged her in ways that even her flawless makeup couldn't hide. She moved around the intimate dining room with nervous energy, adjusting the place settings for the third time, smoothing wrinkles that weren't there from the cream tablecloth, and checking her reflection in the antique mirror that hung above the mahogany sideboard. Tonight was their wedding anniversary, a date that had once filled her with joy and anticipation. In the early years, Charles had surprised her with romantic gestures, white roses delivered to her room, private dinners by candlelight, even a weekend getaway to their favorite cottage in Scotland. But those days felt like a lifetime ago, like memories from someone else's marriage. Diana had spent hours getting ready, choosing a simple but elegant black dress that Charles had once complimented, styling her hair in the soft waves he used to run his fingers through, and applying just enough makeup to hide the dark circles that had become permanent fixtures under her eyes. She'd even worn the sapphire earrings he'd given her for their 5th anniversary, back when he still gave her gifts that meant something. The table was set for two with their finest china, the Waterford crystal glasses catching the light from the candles Diana had lit throughout the room. She'd asked the kitchen staff to prepare Charles's favorite meal, roasted lamb with rosemary, the way his grandmother used to make it. Every detail had been carefully planned, every element designed to remind him of better times, of moments when they'd actually been happy together. But as Diana stood there in the soft glow of candlelight, smoothing her dress one final time, a familiar knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. Deep down, she knew this dinner was probably pointless. The marriage had been hanging by a thread for years, held together only by duty, the children, and the hope that somehow, someday, they might find their way back to each other. The phone call that had arranged tonight's dinner had been brief and businesslike. Charles's private secretary had contacted Diana's office to schedule a private discussion regarding the Wales family's future arrangements. Even their anniversary dinner had been reduced to a formal appointment. Diana heard the familiar sound of Charles's footsteps in the corridor outside the dining room. After 14 years of marriage, she could identify his walk anywhere. Measured, purposeful, the stride of a man who had never in his life been kept waiting. She took a deep breath, forced her brightest smile, and prepared to greet her husband. Prince Charles entered the room looking every inch the future king. His navy suit was impeccably tailored, his tie perfectly knotted, his graying hair combed to perfection. But the man who had once looked at her with desire, with affection, even with simple kindness, now regarded her with the polite distance of a diplomat meeting a foreign dignitary. "Diana," he said with a slight nod, making no move to kiss her cheek or offer any of the casual physical affection that had once been natural between them. "Charles," she replied, her voice bright with forced cheer. "Happy anniversary." He didn't return the greeting. Instead, he glanced around the room, taking in the candles, the carefully set table, the obvious effort she'd put into making the evening special. "This is quite elaborate," he said, and Diana couldn't tell if he was pleased or irritated by her preparations. "I thought we should mark the day," Diana said, gesturing toward the chairs. 14 years deserves recognition, don't you think?" Charles sat down across from her, his movements stiff and formal. "Indeed, 14 years." The way he said it made Diana's heart sink. There was no warmth in his voice, no nostalgia, no hint of the shared memories that should have connected them on this day. He spoke about their marriage the same way he might discuss a business contract that had run its course. Diana poured wine into their glasses, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. Do you remember our first anniversary? She asked, desperate to bridge the growing silence between them. You surprised me with those white roses, dozens of them. The entire sitting room looked like a garden. Charles took a sip of his wine without making eye contact. I remember. You said they reminded you of my wedding dress, Diana continued, her voice getting softer as the memory washed over her. You said I looked like a fairy tale princess that day. That was a long time ago, Diana. The dismissive tone in his voice hit her like a slap. She set down her wine glass more forcefully than she'd intended, the crystal making a sharp sound against the china. Not that long ago, she said, trying to keep the hurt out of her voice. 14 years. In the grand scheme of things, that's 14 years too long. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Diana stared at Charles, certain she must have misheard him. But the expression on his face, cold, resolved, almost relieved to have finally said it out loud, told her she'd heard correctly. Charles, she whispered, what did you just say? He looked directly at her then, perhaps for the first time since he'd entered the room. I said 14 years too long. This marriage has been a mistake from the beginning, Diana. We both know it. It's time we stop pretending otherwise. Diana felt the room spinning around her. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white as she tried to steady herself. A mistake? Our entire marriage? What about William? What about Harry? Are you saying our children were mistakes? Don't be dramatic, Charles said with infuriating calm. The boys are wonderful. They're the only good thing to come from this arrangement. But that doesn't change the fact that we should never have married in the first place. Arrangement. Diana's voice was rising now, all pretense of composure abandoned. Is that what you call what we had? An arrangement? Charles sighed as if explaining something obvious to a slow child. What else would you call it? You were young, suitable, from the right background. I needed a wife. The palace needed an heir. It served its purpose. Diana stared at him in horror. In all their years of growing apart, through all the fights and the coldness and the bitter silences, she had never heard him speak so callously about their relationship. She had always held on to the belief that somewhere, buried deep beneath the duty and the protocol, there had been something real between them, even if it had been brief. Served its purpose? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. That's all I was to you? A means to an end? Charles poured himself more wine, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Diana, you're not naive. You knew what kind of marriage this was when you said yes. Royal marriages aren't built on love stories and fairy tales. They're built on duty, compatibility, and mutual respect. But I did love you, Diana said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. I loved you so much it physically hurt. I would have done anything for you, Charles. Anything to make you happy. For just a moment, something flickered across Charles's face. Regret, perhaps, or a shadow of the man he used to be. But it was gone so quickly Diana might have imagined it. Love, he said, the words sounding foreign and uncomfortable in his mouth. You loved the idea of being Princess of Wales. You loved the attention, the adoration, the chance to be the most photographed woman in the world. Diana felt as if he'd physically struck her. How can you say that? You know that's not true. I hated the attention. I hated the cameras and the constant scrutiny. I loved you, Charles. Just you. No, Charles said firmly. You loved the fairy tale. But fairy tales aren't real, Diana. They never were. The cruelty of his words took Diana's breath away. She had spent 14 years trying to be the wife he wanted, the princess the country expected, the mother their children deserved. She had endured eating disorders, depression, and crushing loneliness, all while maintaining a public face of grace and composure. And now he was telling her it had all been meaningless. What about when William was born? Diana asked desperately, grasping for any memory that might contradict his cold assessment. You cried when you held him for the first time. You said we were a real family then. Charles's expression didn't change. I was emotional about becoming a father. That had nothing to do with us as a couple. And Harry, when Harry was born, you said, I said what was expected of me, Charles interrupted. What the press wanted to hear, what would look good in the photographs. None of it was real, Diana. None of it. Diana felt something inside her breaking, not just her heart, but her entire understanding of her own life. If nothing had been real, if every moment of happiness she'd clung to had been a lie or a performance, then what had these 14 years been? What had she been? So when you brought me flowers, when you held my hand during those early royal engagements, when you comforted me after my father died, all of that was just performance? Charles was quiet for a long moment, and Diana held her breath, hoping against hope that he would contradict her, that he would admit to at least some genuine feeling for her. I tried to be kind to you, he said finally. You were young and out of your depth. I felt responsible for your adjustment to royal life. But kindness isn't love, Diana. Responsibility isn't love. The words hit Diana like physical blows. She doubled over in her chair, sobbing openly now, all dignity abandoned. 14 years of her life, the best years of her youth, had been given to a man who had never felt anything real for her, who had seen her as nothing more than a duty to be discharged. But what about Camilla? Diana asked through her tears, the name of her husband's longtime mistress feeling like poison in her mouth. If you never loved me, what about her? Did you love her? For the first time that evening, Charles's composure cracked. A flash of something genuine crossed his face. Pain, longing, perhaps even love. It was the first real emotion Diana had seen from him, and it cut her deeper than anything he'd said so far. Camilla, he said softly, is different. Different how? Diana demanded. How is she different from me? Charles looked away, staring at the flickering candles Diana had lit with such hope just hours before. She understands me. She always has. We connect in ways that you and I never did. Because you never gave us a chance, Diana cried. You had already given your heart to someone else before you even proposed to me. I was competing with a ghost from the beginning. You weren't competing with anyone, Charles said quietly. There was never a competition because there was never a choice. I married you because I had to. I stayed with Camilla because I wanted to. The honesty was more devastating than any lie could have been. Diana had spent years wondering what she had done wrong, how she had failed as a wife, what she could have done differently to earn her husband's love. Now she understood that it had never been about her failings or inadequacies. It had simply been about the fact that Charles's heart had never been available to give. So all these years, Diana said, wiping her eyes with her napkin, while I was trying to be a good wife, while I was having your children and representing the crown and pretending to be happy in public, you were thinking of her? Charles nodded, not even having the grace to look ashamed. Yes. And you never thought to tell me? You never thought I deserved to know the truth? What would have been the point? Charles asked. It wouldn't have changed anything. We still would have had to stay married for the sake of the crown, for the sake of the children. It would have only made things more difficult. Diana laughed, a bitter sound that had no humor in it. More difficult? You think finding out now, after 14 years, is easier than it would have been then? Charles had no answer for that. Diana sat in the candlelight, looking at the man she had loved more than life itself, the man who had just told her that every moment of happiness she'd experienced in their marriage had been a delusion on her part. The food had grown cold on their plates, untouched. The wine he'd poured sat abandoned. Even the candles seemed to be burning less brightly, as if the light itself was giving up. What happens now? Diana asked finally. Now we make this official, Charles said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out an envelope. The papers have been drawn up. We'll announce the separation next month. The Queen has already been informed. Diana stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. You came to our anniversary dinner with divorce papers? Separation papers, Charles corrected. Divorce will come later, once we've worked out the details regarding the children and your future role. Diana felt numb. After everything she'd heard tonight, the presence of legal documents seemed almost anticlimactic. You planned this entire evening to serve me with papers? I planned this evening to finally be honest with you, Charles said. I thought you deserved that much. Honest, Diana repeated hollowly. After 14 years of lies, you thought one evening of honesty would make up for everything? Charles stood up from the table, smoothing his jacket with the same mechanical precision he brought to everything in his life. I never meant to hurt you, Diana, but I can't pretend anymore. I won't pretend anymore. Diana remained seated, staring at the separation papers that would officially end the fairy tale marriage the world had celebrated. And what about our sons? What am I supposed to tell William and Harry? We'll tell them together, Charles said, that sometimes people are better apart than together. That this doesn't change how much we love them. How much we love them. Diana's voice was sharp with bitter irony. Or how much I love them, because love seems to be a foreign concept to you. Charles paused at the door, and for a moment Diana thought he might apologize, might show some remorse for the devastation he'd just caused. Instead, he simply said, "I'll have my secretary contact yours about the logistics." And then he was gone, leaving Diana alone with the cold dinner, the dying candles, and the ruins of everything she'd believed about her life. Diana sat in the silence for a long time, staring at the separation papers he'd left on the table beside his untouched plate. 14 years of marriage reduced to legal documentation. 14 years of love, at least on her side, dismissed as youthful delusion. She thought about their wedding day, how she'd felt walking down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral with the whole world watching. She'd been so young, so hopeful, so utterly convinced that she was stepping into a love story for the ages. The irony wasn't lost on her that the fairy tale had officially ended exactly where it had begun, on their anniversary. As Diana finally stood to blow out the candles, she caught sight of herself in the mirror again. The woman looking back at her wasn't the hopeful young bride of 1981, or even the desperate wife who had prepared dinner earlier that evening. She was someone else entirely, someone who had finally heard the truth, no matter how devastating it had been. For the first time in 14 years, Diana knew exactly where she stood with her husband. The uncertainty was over, the hoping was finished, the delusion was shattered. It was the most painful gift Charles had ever given her, but perhaps it was also the most valuable. Tomorrow she would begin the process of figuring out who she was beyond the title of Princess of Wales, beyond the role of Charles's wife, beyond the fairy tale that had never really existed. Tonight, she would mourn the marriage that had died not with argument or infidelity or gradual indifference, but with simple, brutal honesty delivered over an anniversary dinner that no one would ever celebrate again. The last candle flickered out, plunging the room into darkness, and with it went the final remnant of Diana's belief in the love story the world thought they'd witnessed. The fairy tale was over, but perhaps for the first time in 14 years, the real story of Diana's life could finally begin. If this heartbreaking story of love's end moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most honest words can be the most devastating. Have you ever experienced a moment when everything you believed about a relationship was shattered? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories from behind palace walls.